August 2020. In the two-story house, an hacienda today was rather quiet, joyless, and empty. Everything looked as if time had ceased to exist here altogether. It had been like this for about 3 weeks now. 3 weeks ago, on the 1st of August, a young man named Augustin Fabien, 26 years old, went missing. There was absolutely nothing left, no clues, no traces. It seemed there were no chances of finding him. This man had a mother and a sister who couldn't seem to recover from what had happened. Priscilla Fabien, 24 years old, sat in the living room, staring blankly into space. The clock on the wall ticked away the seconds peacefully, its insistent sound piercing her ears. Priscilla had already cried all her tears. Now she only felt immense emptiness. It was as if a part of her soul had disappeared with her brother. Her mother, Estella Fabien, had hardly left her room for 2 weeks. She didn't want to talk, eat, or do anything at all. Estella refused to believe that her son was missing. She couldn't accept it. Each of them dealt with this stress in their own way. "Does your mom even come out of her room for a little bit?" Arthur Cabrera asked quietly. Priscilla was supposed to marry this man in a month. Arthur was 33 years old and at the peak of his strength. "Priscilla, darling, can you hear me?" he asked, snapping his fingers a couple of times in front of his future wife's face. "No, she doesn't come out at all. Mom loves Augustin very much, and it's not easy for her to come to terms with his disappearance," Priscilla finally said in a gloomy voice, coming back to herself. "You're not well at all," Arthur said with concern. "Everything's fine. I love you so much, and I'm really worried. Let me give you some tranquilizers, you look awful. I'm scared for you. Arturo, do you think they'll find him?" Priscilla continued. "Of course they'll find him. I'm more than confident nothing bad happened to him. Yes, but you know he had a substance abuse problem." "Darling, Augustin was getting better," Arturo said in a quiet voice. "Moreover, he was very worried about Mom and you. He didn't want to upset you anymore. I don't think he's somewhere using substances right now. Especially now, your brother wouldn't just leave without telling you." "Yes, I said too much. How could I even think like that? Everything's fine. Everyone's just on edge right now. And your nerves are stretched to the limit. Now memories from our happy childhood are coming back to me when everything was good. Augustin and I used to love teasing Mom, and then she'd tease us back. I wish I could go back to that time, even for just a minute. Darling, sit here for a bit, and I'll take a cup of coffee to your mom." "Okay," the girl nodded. Priscilla had hardly slept in these 3 weeks. Nightmares simply wouldn't let her. The worst possible scenarios involving her brother kept coming to her mind. What if he was actually using drugs right now and didn't realize anything? Or even worse, what if he overdosed and his body lay somewhere among the trash in some dive? She fought off all these thoughts as best as she could. Fortunately, she wasn't alone. She had her Arturo and her 2 best friends, Susanna and Catalina. When Priscilla brought the cup of water to her lips to take the tranquilizers, there was a knock at the door. She hurried to open it. Her friends were at the door. "Hello, Priscilla." "Oh, I'm so glad to see you, you have no idea." "We're glad to see you too, Sunshine. How are you? How's your mom?" Susanna asked. She had green eyes and shoulder-length black hair. "Mom, the same as always. I hope she gets at least a little better." "Everything will work out, I'm sure," said Catalina. The girl's hair was slightly longer than Susanna's. She was a blonde with gray-blue eyes. "Why are you standing at the threshold?" "Come inside," said Catalina. At that moment, Arturo was coming down the stairs. "Hello, girls. Priscilla, I persuaded your mom to have a cup of coffee." "Really? That's great. How are the search efforts going?" Susanna asked once everyone had settled on the couch. "They're going intensively, but it seems futile. There's just no sign of my brother. Not here, not anywhere. It's like he vanished into thin air. I'm sure they'll find him. You and I, Priscilla, remember that. Everything will be all right, said Catalina, hugging her friend tightly. August 2021. A whole year had passed since that day, the 1st of August. Arturo and Priscilla had been married for a long time now. Priscilla had now changed her surname from Fabian to Cabrera. Despite this new chapter in her still young life, she of course could not forget Agustin. Sometimes he visited her in her dreams. They weren't nightmares at all. In fact, the dreams were very bright and peaceful. Priscilla sometimes thought that Agustin had become her guardian angel. The girl's mother, Estella, managed to start afresh. It was difficult, but there was nothing else to be done. Agustin still couldn't be found. He had been officially missing for over a year now. No trips abroad, no moves within the country or the city, no body, and no new clues or leads. Everything was futile. And everyone comforted themselves with the thought that he had somehow started a new life in an unknown place. It was just easier to think that way. After a year, it was noticeable how much Estella had aged. From numerous fits of hysteria, wrinkles appeared on Priscilla's forehead and nose. The once youthful and vibrant face of the girl became more somber and not so young anymore. But the eyes remained the same. The face changed, but the eyes didn't. Arthur had his own thriving car sales business. He owned 2 showrooms and had amassed a decent fortune. The couple lived separately, but their daughter never forgot about her mother. She visited her every week. Priscilla herself had found a new hobby, painting on an easel. It was another way to distract herself. Catalina and Susanna would often visit the couple. Eventually, Catalina's boyfriend, Adrian, started joining them. The 5 of them would frequently have fun evenings together. The new life seemed happy, but it lasted until a certain moment. And then, those moments became more and more frequent. November 2021. Every year, on the 1st of November, the Day of the Dead was celebrated here. The streets were filled with festivity. There was a celebratory atmosphere and an unbearable energy everywhere. On the same evening, Priscilla and Arthur were supposed to meet their friends and go out to celebrate. Arthur was planning to return home by 7 in the evening, but he never showed up. Priscilla was left alone at home. Pouring herself a cup of brewed coffee, the girl suddenly heard some noises outside the windows. At that moment, she was on the ground floor. A second later, she noticed a face behind the glass. She dropped the cup in fear, which shattered on the floor, leaving fragments and spilled coffee. In mute shock, she looked into other windows. There were also people standing there. At first, she thought that there were plenty of people like them on the streets. Everyone was in costumes and wearing makeup. But then she realized that something was definitely wrong here. The strange costumed people stood close to the windows, staring directly at her. There were 5 of them in total, each positioned at a specific spot. They were wearing rather peculiar costumes, and their makeup was quite unusual. Despite the colors on their faces, they all smiled. Priscilla didn't know what to do in such a situation. She immediately felt uneasy as they continued to scrutinize her from all angles. They didn't do anything else. Then, as if on cue, they abruptly stepped away from the windows and left the house in different directions. Suddenly, the phone rang loudly next to the girl. Priscilla screamed in fear, then breathed out and picked up the receiver with trembling hands. "Hello," an unfamiliar voice sounded. Priscilla stayed silent. "Hello, can you hear me?" Yes. "Who is this?" Priscilla replied. "This is Priscilla Cabrera?" "Yes, what's the matter?" "The matter is that your husband is in the hospital. He was beaten up and robbed. He's okay now, but it would be better if someone picked him up." "Oh my God." "Yes, I'll come right away." After the call, Priscilla immediately went to the hospital and picked up Arturo. His eyebrow and lip were bruised. There was a bruise under his eye. "Arturo, what's going on? Why don't you want to tell me anything?" The girl tried to get an answer when they were already home. Nothing's going on. Arturo, at least tell me, did you know those people? Yes, I knew them. And who were they? Darling, I've been hiding this for a long time. Arturo finally gave in. But I don't even know where to start. I can't understand why, but someone started following me. I think it's one of my competitors. We need to go to the police. No, it'll only make it worse. Have you seen your face? You just don't know him. I fear to imagine what he would do to me, let alone to you, if he finds out we went to the authorities. To me? Of course, he knows I have a wife. He knows. Priscilla said thoughtfully. What? Strange people came today. They stood by our windows and smiled. I was very scared, Arturo. Right by our windows? That's dreadful. You were all alone. Everything's fine now. They were probably just accomplices of your competitor. Arturo held Priscilla tightly, promising not to leave her alone anymore. March 2022. On a spring morning, the Cabrera household received a call on their landline. They were informed that a woman named Estela Fabian had been admitted to the hospital with a stroke. Upon arriving at the hospital, Priscilla and Arturo headed straight to the reception. While the man inquired about the necessary information, Priscilla noticed what seemed to be a familiar crown. It was as if she saw the familiar head with dark short curls. The crown of the person looked painfully similar to Augustin's head. Priscilla trembled. Augustin? Priscilla whispered softly. Arturo immediately looked up. He glanced at the person standing next to them. The person turned around. It wasn't Augustin. I'm sorry, I'm not Augustin, the stranger said cheerfully. Priscilla was deeply disappointed. They received all the necessary information at the reception, and a doctor approached them. He informed them that visiting wasn't allowed for the time being. Arturo tried to negotiate with the elderly doctor to visit Estela. Meanwhile, Priscilla watched the continuously arriving sick people. Everything worked out, darling. Let's go to Mom, a man's voice sounded above her head. Really? Thank you so much. What do you mean? We're one family, darling. Arturo and Priscilla entered the room. Estela lay on the hospital bed. Only the life support machine indicated that she was indeed alive. After all, the woman's face was pale and her body completely lifeless. At the last moment, when it was time to leave, Arturo leaned over Estela's forehead to kiss it. Priscilla considered it a sweet gesture. It seemed like everything was fine. But the next morning brought bad news from the hospital. Estela Fabian died from cardiac arrest. Life had just begun to improve. Arturo's competitor left him alone. Most had somewhat come to terms with the loss of Augustin. But now, everything seemed to be falling apart again. The overwhelming memories of her brother and her mother's death flooded in. The pain crashed down on the girl like a massive avalanche. Something unpleasant clenched around her chest. It hadn't even been 2 years, and in that time, she had lost both her beloved brother and her dear mother. Why did this keep happening? Arturo constantly reassured her. He did absolutely everything to distract her from her thoughts, even for a second. It was quite difficult. Priscilla fell into a deep apathy. September 2022. Another 7 months had passed since the businessman and his beloved wife began their life together. When they said goodbye to Estela in March, another part of Priscilla's soul was buried at that moment. She lost a part of herself again. First with the disappearance of her brother, and then with her mother's death. The wrinkles increased, and rare gray hairs appeared. After so many months, Priscilla was able to somewhat regain herself and enjoy moments of life. Her husband remained by her side. She wasn't alone. September 26th, 5:34 p.m. It was late September again, with the weather often dismal and rainy at this time of year. Priscilla and Arturo went out for groceries. Arriving at the parking lot, they got out of the car without umbrellas, as the walk wasn't too long. Arturo tried to cheer up his wife, cracking many jokes. Priscilla chuckled softly, and it seemed to help a little. Sometimes they touched each other's hands, intertwining their fingers. They often did so, especially when Priscilla felt sad about something. They had passed more than half of the way when suddenly the irreversible happened. Through the sounds of the downpour and thunder, two deafening sounds rang out, even louder than the storm and the large raindrops. Priscilla didn't immediately realize what had happened. Time seemed to freeze. The loud pounding of her heart started pulsating endlessly in her ears. A large knot of anxiety instantly formed in her stomach. It grew bigger and bigger. Slowly, she turned her head towards Arturo. His face instantly turned pale. The smile slowly slid off her face. Arturo also turned his face towards his wife, suppressing a smile-like expression before falling onto his back. Priscilla looked back and saw someone standing 4 meters away from them shoot her husband in the back. He was dressed entirely in dark clothing. Priscilla saw him for the first time in her life. When Arturo fell onto the wet asphalt, the mysterious person got into a car and drove away from the parking lot, leaving them both behind. "Arturo!" Priscilla shouted after a minute of shock. She fell to her knees beside her husband on the dirty asphalt. Large raindrops streamed down his deathly pale face, but he was still smiling. "Arturo, no. Darling, can you hear me?" the girl screamed through tears. In the sky, thunder roared even louder. The rain intensified, and there were no people around. Priscilla was in a strong shock. She couldn't call for an ambulance. The girl couldn't fully grasp what was happening. Her fingers were trembling. She embraced the lifeless body lying prone on the ground. The bloody puddle beneath the body kept growing. The wet asphalt was already taking on bright red hues. Priscilla's hands were also covered in blood. Wet strands of long hair brushed against Arturo's face. "I love you," Arturo whispered. Bright blood began to flow from his mouth. "Don't die, Arturo. Please." He struggled to keep his eyes open. Thick tears blurred the girl's vision. She held onto her husband tightly, afraid to let go even for a moment. Everything was happening too fast. It was all too unreal. None of this should have happened. And then, the end came. Arturo closed his eyes for good. Closed them for the last time. Priscilla began to scream loudly again, calling for help. She shook with sobs as she held the lifeless body. September 26th, 7 p.m. After some time, the ambulance arrived. The rain was still pouring, getting darker. Everything seemed hazy to Priscilla. She was soaked and covered in blood. With a dirty hand, the girl smoked a cigarette. It seemed like she wasn't blinking at all. Her eyes were dull and lifeless. She didn't talk to anyone, as if she were in a trance. Priscilla stared blankly ahead, into nothingness. Just like after Augustine's disappearance. Now she had lost everyone. Augustine, her mom, her husband. A thin stream of smoke rose up, dissipating in the air. Just like the last piece of the girl's soul was dissipating. The funeral preparations lasted for 3 days. Catalina and Adrian constantly supported Priscilla. Susanna rushed from another city as fast as possible. September 29th. On the day of the funeral, the weather was equally dismal. The mood of everyone in attendance matched the gloomy weather conditions. Priscilla found everything unpleasant on that day. How could one come to terms with losing 3 loved ones? Saying goodbye to the deceased here felt more like a celebration and festivity. But this death wasn't a celebration for Priscilla. The girl found herself once again plunged into deep apathy and indifference towards everything. Now, she was smoking a pack of cigarettes a day, seemingly unaware of it. Colleagues and friends of Arturo were present at the ceremony. In the middle of the funeral service, Priscilla distanced herself from the crowd. She sat on one of the distant benches under a tree to light another cigarette. Her gaze was equally lifeless. Surprised, suddenly a familiar voice sounded behind the girl's shoulder. Priscilla raised her head. Susan was standing nearby. She also took a seat on the bench. What? What are you surprised about? Priscilla asked emotionlessly, not understanding. Surprised by your husband's death, her friend asked in a usual tone. There was no hint of sympathy in her voice now. A spark seemed to ignite in Priscilla's eyes again. I don't understand you. Why are you asking me this? Be glad he's already in the grave. Or do you think your brother, who was against your marriage, disappeared without a trace by accident? He was just an unnecessary witness and knew things about your husband that you somehow didn't. Susan blurted out in one breath. Susan, what nonsense are you talking? What does my brother have to do with anything? Have you been drinking today? Your premature little brother did linger too long indeed, Susan continued, smirking. He hadn't touched alcohol for a whole month and was very happy about it. But there was one but. Augustin was vehemently against your marriage to Arturo. Furthermore, Augustin accidentally found out what Arturo was really up to. Was he against it? Did he know what Arturo was up to? You must be drunk. No, dear Priscilla, I'm not drunk. You must have been the one drunk. Augustin saw with his own eyes how your future husband, then very cruelly, dealt with a man. That man seemed to owe your husband a large sum of money. Because of that, Arturo smashed his skull with a rock. Now Priscilla put out her cigarette and tossed it away. Oh, how much you didn't know about him, dear little lamb Priscilla. If you don't shut up, I'll hit you, said the girl. She couldn't bear to hear it. As if they weren't talking about her husband. Not about her Arturo, who brushed dust off her and was very kind during his lifetime. And you know, one thing has always surprised me. He really did love you. I don't know why. What's so special about you? Priscilla didn't respond. Do you know where your brother really is? Or rather, his body. Enough, shouted Priscilla. But Susanna continued to spew venom from her mouth. Arturo buried him under the sands in the desert. He's rotting there to this day. How do you? Something clicked in Priscilla's mind. She inadvertently remembered a moment from their past. When she and Arturo weren't married yet. Once, she saw Augustin and Arturo arguing over something, and the man wanted to hit him but didn't because Priscilla entered the room. Then she remembered another moment, in the hospital. When Priscilla thought they were facing someone resembling Augustin, Arturo immediately became alert, the smile disappeared from his face, and he looked very strangely at that person. Please, stop. Enough, Arturo. Let me go, your brother cried. Seems he even broke a couple of bones. Nobody beat him up on the Day of the Dead, nope. Arturo was fighting with some people who got in his way. That night, when he was telling you about his rival, he killed another man. He killed ruthlessly and without hesitation. And that man just once sold his goods on your husband's territory. I was present at almost all of his meetings. And you know what usually happened afterward? The brunette asked, leaning her face a little closer to Priscilla. Long and hot sex, Susanna said slowly. Back when you thought he was selling cars and meeting with buyers. Something flared up in her consciousness again. On November 1st, the Day of the Dead, Arturo's face wasn't the only thing beaten, the bones in his hands were bruised too. But the girl didn't want to dwell on that. Arturo was some kind of authority, selling drugs and weapons. And in the end, he paid for it with his life. At that moment, a frightened Catalina ran up. Girls, what's going on? He specifically asked the hospital to tell you he was beaten up. To make it all look believable. Arturo injected something into your mom that doesn't show up in autopsies. After all, she knew something about him too. Priscilla, what is she saying? Priscilla closed her eyes, trying to calm her breathing and collect herself. I turned away at that moment. I turned away when Arturo leaned in towards Mom. He could have really injected her with something. Flashed through Priscilla's mind amidst the tumultuous thoughts. Here's another Dolly sheep, oblivious and clueless about everything, Susan chuckled, cheerfully rising from the bench. Susan. What, Susan? Are you high? What on earth are you even babbling about? Catalina shouted. Priscilla. Priscilla said nothing in response. She sat there, eyes closed. She felt sick to her stomach. She just couldn't believe Arthur was involved in her brother and mother's deaths. Everything that had happened over the years was so obvious, yet she either didn't want to see it or took it as the norm. It all added up. Arthur killed Augustine and Mom. And now he was dead, taking all his secrets to the grave. But now those secrets were no more. Who had Priscilla really been living with for so long? A murderer, a drug dealer, a very scary man. Priscilla shook her head and opened her eyes. Then she abruptly stood up from the bench and slapped Susan across the face with all her force, sending her flying 2 meters back. You disgusting creature! Priscilla screamed. Tell me now, where is my brother? Under which sands? She yelled, grabbing a handful of black hair from the girl's head. What are you doing, you crazy bitch? Is your true self finally revealing? Susan retorted. It's you, bitch. How did it feel to sleep with someone else's husband? How did it feel to be next to a killer and know he's a killer? How did it feel to pretend to be my best friend, you lying piece of trash? Fantastic, Susan laughed mockingly. You're sick in the head. At least I'm not as stupid as you. All of this was happening right in front of your nose, and you didn't even realize it. I don't even care when you started sleeping together. Now I hate Arthur as much as I hate you. You're dead to me, you damn whore. Priscilla punched the girl in the face again. And Susan, on the contrary, laughed and rejoiced even more. Epilogue. Priscilla, Catalina, and Adrian arrived at the specified coordinates. Adrian began excavating at the spot Susanna had indicated. Half an hour passed, then 40 minutes, an hour, until finally they reached something. In the sands lay a large white packet or sack. Priscilla felt uneasy. Would she now see her brother's remains? They pulled the sack out of the pit. Unfolding it, they recoiled in horror. There indeed lay a corpse. A hole was visible in its skull, and its hands were tied behind its back. Some bones were broken. Priscilla fell into a strong hysteria, collapsing to her knees. She didn't want to see anyone. Oh God! Catalina whispered quietly, covering her mouth with her hand. Augustine's remains were buried next to Estella's grave. Despite the immense pain Priscilla had endured over these 2 years, she managed to pull herself out of this state. Writing novels helped her. Every word, every phrase, every character became her companions on the path to healing. In the process of writing, she found solace and understanding, which helped her overcome the pain. Her books became bestsellers, and her name became known in the literary world. Priscilla captivated readers with her stories of love, adventure, and self-discovery. But most importantly, in her works, her brother Augustine and mother Estella happily lived in a 2-story mansion. Dear viewers, if you enjoyed the story, please support the video by liking it and leaving a comment. Thank you very much.